together, coming up short and giving up never. Weave it together. Come along, come along, come along, come along. Mending it together. A world on fire can't.
Welcome to Catalyzing Change Week. This year's Catalyzing Change Week is about solutions from the front lines by social innovators.
In 2022, Catalyst 2030 concentrated its efforts on bringing proximate leaders and frontline solutions to the forefront. Collaborations led by members from the Global South produced groundbreaking reports on climate and transforming education, with an emphasis on offering local solutions. We continued our mission to create an enabling environment for social entrepreneurs to flourish by initiating a letter to donors, signed by more than 1,200 social entrepreneurs and innovators. The Catalyst 2030 awards ceremony was spectacular, and the awards themselves welcomed by the private sector, governments, bio multilaterals and donors.
Catalyst 2030 as a movement is disruptive.
One of the best things I think that's come out of Catalyst 2030 so far is incredible collaboration across the ecosystem that just didn't exist before Catalyst came into being.
The thing I love most about Catalyst is that it's an open movement for social entrepreneurs around the world.
I would encourage anyone who's looking to be more connected with their local communities around social development goals to come along to Catalyzing Change Week.
Welcome to Catalyzing Change Week.
Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to be a part of Catalyzing Change Week and to moderate this rich and timely discussion with the IEFG Global South Forum. My name is Ati Worku. I'm the co-CEO of the African Visionary Fund, and our mission is to drive more unrestricted, unburdensome funding to African organizations to accelerate their impact. The purpose of today's session is to engage in dialogue with philanthropy about how to think through power imbalances in education funding, why rethinking the status quo matters to the SDGs, and what funders can do differently. Before we start, I would like to do some housekeeping to share how our time together will be spent. We'll begin with a participatory brainstorming session where I invite all of you in the audience to contribute to our discussion around shifting power. Then we'll go into a discussion with our esteemed panelists where I'll moderate a conversation around solutions for shifting power in the field. Through that panel, I encourage you all to make remarks in the chat. And then the panel will be followed by about a 25-minute Q&A session before we close. So please add any questions you have at that point to the Q&A box or to the chat box and raise your hand during the portion of the session. Thank you for engaging in this topic with us today. So to get us started with the participatory brainstorm on power imbalances in education, this will be a discussion on education systems, particularly related to education funders. We have about 4 questions to get through. So I'll start with the first one, give it a few minutes, about 5 minutes or so, and then can bring up the next one as well. We'll also drop the questions in the chat. And this is an open discussion in between all of you in the room. So I encourage all of you to engage either by raising your hand or putting it in your thoughts in the chat. The first question is, what power do you think education funders hold? How does this manifest and what are the implications? Thank you again. I just put the question in the chat for everyone as well. Don't be shy. Feel free to bring out your thoughts or just put them in the chat to get started. Maybe to help kind of our thinking, I'll also add some of the other questions that we have, because maybe some of the other ones might come across easier to start with. So the other question we have is the shift the power debate. Is it new? What is going to be different this time? Also drop this one in the chat. Or Nita, if you don't mind me calling upon you to kind of elaborate some of the points you put in the chat.
I can probably start. I don't know if Gail wants to come in first. Okay, I'll just get started.
Sorry, I didn't hear. Okay, yeah, maybe I'll just kick off. I mean, there's an inherent interdependency, I was saying, between non-profit organizations and funders. There are some funders who are implementing funders, but in the main, I like to call it, there's a symbiotic relationship. But you have to understand that it's a power relationship in terms of money being quite a powerful resource, and around who gets money, what gets funded, how much gets funded. And I think funders have to grapple with these debates with their boards in terms of how to create more of a collaboration and partnership with the nonprofit organizations that you work with.
Maybe, Ati, I can add to that. So I completely agree with what Gail's saying and what the others have written in their notes, that there is this power imbalance, so to speak, and interdependencies. But I just I was reflecting before coming on to this panel as to say, what does this mean for other sectors? And I don't think it is relatively new or it's only exclusive to philanthropy. I think wherever there is access to resources, and somebody else is developing services, there is always this balance of who has access to funding. So in the private equity, it's the same. In venture philanthropy, it's the same. In venture capital, it's the same and across, right? With banking to clients and all of that. So that power balance always stay. But I think what is unusual in the non-for-profit sector or the civil society and how it's getting funded is our clients don't pay for the services. Because in a for-profit space, if you like, the customer has the power. And because the customer is retail and it is kind of, the denomination is larger than the sum, you have diversity and you have, there's levers that you can act on. But where you have a funder who is funding your program, but the client doesn't pay. So somebody's buying from a civil society organization on behalf of the client, that's where this power dynamics really has to be navigated through and moderated, because that's where it is very challenging, I suppose. I just wanted to kind of get the context on how I am reflecting on this. Say it is not different than any other sector, but what is different is the who pays for it and who uses the service.
Have we lost our moderator?
I think we have lost Atty. Sure. My dog's trying to join in the conversation too. We're trying to contact Atty to see if she can jump back in. But I'm wondering if anyone else in the chat wants to jump in. There's a lot of conversation about power involving money, but that's not the only power. That's not the only form of power, right? Mayur, did you want to come in and speak to the point that you've just made at the end there?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. So, yeah, an example of power that we hold as funders is typically building the narrative. I mean, I've seen this in the past in India, especially around public education versus private education. Depending on sort of where the resources get invested, sometimes a narrative sort of gets built around which one's better, rather than actually looking at the space as a collaborative space where both private and public schooling can sort of work towards a common mission. So there's a huge responsibility on us as funders as well, to shape the narrative and also to build the narrative in a way that actually ultimately sort of ends up helping the cause or working on the cause, which is ensuring that education is provided to everyone, quality education is provided to everyone. So yeah, that's another power that funders hold. Thank you.
Thanks, Mayur. I think Nita, previously you were going to jump in before Gail spoke up. Be good to hear your perspective.
Thanks. Yeah, no, just kind of agreeing to Raman, and also I feel, in addition to who pays, sometimes element of how success is defined, how, what is the definition of education in itself and the principles that determine education. Recognizing that there's deep colonization embedded within this space, and how the narrative gets deciphered here, especially from that colonial space or from an indigenous education learning space. That's the other dynamics in terms of the power that plays out in the sector. Thank you.
So does anyone here believe that funders don't have power? There's a whole, this shift, the power narrative, has that been, can that be successful to an extent that we get to an equal power dynamic? Equal or unequal, the other way around? Maybe to put it another way, with all of these shift the power efforts that we're going to talk to in a few minutes, does anyone who's joined us today have any thoughts as to how, like the practicalities of how funders can use this power more consciously or more wisely? Yeah, this is a question for everyone. We're encouraging before the panel discussion, everyone to raise your views on what power is and how funders use it.
Can I come in?
Of course, please do.
So I think power, I feel, is a mindset. And yes, there is reality where we consider people who've got money have got power. But if they spend the money and the goodwill they get out of it, how well they spend it, that is also, I mean, that's another dynamic and you have to handle it. But again, I think we can start with what's within our control, and our mindset can be within our control. So if we go with that, we have got something good to offer to the world, people who are working on the grassroots. And how do we help funders realize and see if they can be part of it, that they can also help shift the narrative and make the difference. So, but for long, we have connected power with money. And I think that's why it's about, we say, okay, help us. I guess it's a lot of civil movements and people who've got freedom to their country. They didn't have money. They fought for independence. People came together and people was power. Your passion, your mission became power. And you got people behind you, whether it is a funder, whether it's a grassroots organization, or whether it's a bigger NGO. So that's my thought. I'll pause there.
It's a super point about power being mindset. Does anyone else want to pick up on that and describe what sorts of mindsets constitute power? If you put your camera on, I'm going to take that as a desire to speak. So, Gannon, I'm looking at you.
Yeah, I'm going to agree very much with what was just said. I think we have an opportunity to be looking clearly in the mirror at these clearly inequitable systems. At the same time, I think we also have to, if we're really going to take a careful look, I think
Gannon, sorry, we can't.
That sort of. Can you hear me? Okay.
It's catching up. It's catching up now.
Sorry about that. The vast riches, the wonderful resources that communities have to bring are often invisible. And I do worry sometimes that our analysis cedes too much to the power of donors, to the power of the systems. So I think our role is to do both, to look at that clear-eyed and also to never forget that incredible wealth of the vision that communities have, the resources that they have, to hold both of those. And sorry again for the connection issues and any background noise you're getting.
No worries. Does anyone else have any thoughts on this? We've got a couple of minutes, and Ati's rejoining us. We've got a couple of minutes before we move into a conversation on all of this with our panelists today. Does anyone else have any controversial views in particular, provocative views on power to throw into the mix before we get going? This is your chance.
Can we shift power where it is more equitable and co-creative? Can that be done with donors? And what would it take to make that shift happen? If there's anyone who can make that happen, it's you, Laura. So I leave that in your hands very, very successfully to make happen.
Well, that's the conversation we want to have today. So we're going to hear shortly from 5 different education funders, both on sort of 2 different aspects of power. I think one reflecting on the dynamics and nature, characteristics of power, some of which we've just talked about, and then getting practical, trying to think about what actually does it take, what does it look like when we're, this language can be very big and bold, but what does it look like in practice? So let's move over into the conversation, and if and when Ati rejoins us, I'll pass over the baton to her. We're gonna ask each of our speakers to briefly introduce themselves as the conversation flows. Encourage you all to put questions in the chat throughout, and we will of course have an opportunity after the panel discussion for you to come back in and weigh in the discussion. So firstly, handing over to you, Sadaf. Firelight is famed for having been on this journey of shifting power for a long time now. What does that term, shifting power, mean to you, to Firelight, and to your partners?
Thanks, Laura. So as you mentioned, I'm Sadaf Shalwani with Firelight Foundation. And, you know, as I mentioned earlier in the chat, we think about power in terms of power over wealth and resources, but also in terms of data and knowledge over narrative, over what success looks like around how issues are framed, interpreted, and the decisions that are made accordingly. And so these are the considerations we keep in mind, both in our internal work and external work at Firelight in terms of shifting power. And I want to mention internal work also, because I think many of us want to shift directly to, jump directly to shifting how we do our work with our grantees. But what we learned the hard way is that when you jump right to that and you haven't done the internal work, you actually aren't able to do it well. And so we actually had to take a step back and realize that we had to do some really tough internal work first around how we interacted with each other, how we engaged with each other, what our board and our governance looked like. You're really starting to question those things internally, even as we were shifting things externally. But I'll give you two examples of how we're doing it externally with our grantees, just to make it real. So first, one of the things Firelight has done in the last few years is really shifted our approach so that our initiatives and fundings focus on issues, priorities, and actions that are set by communities. How we do this is actually by first establishing a partnership, even before a proposal is written, even before an RFP goes out. We first established partnerships with community-based organizations who are grounded in and recognized as legitimate and as effective and impactful by their own communities. And then we work with those CBOs to work hand in hand with their communities to actually start unpacking, identifying, and analyzing the key issues facing them, and especially the most vulnerable families in their community and the most vulnerable children in their communities. After that process of learning and planning, then CBOs actually work with their communities to develop a proposal for funding. And so what that means is that that proposal is built on the community's agenda, not a donor's agenda. The second example I can give you is how we go about evaluation and learning. Traditionally, funders will commission an external evaluation to see, to whether and to what extent grantees are meeting objectives and targets. And what we do is we flip this by having the community determine what success looks like, having them work hand in hand with the CBOs to identify what are the indicators that they want to track, indicators of success, indicators of progress, and then having the CBO and their community actually lead the evaluation. We do provide an evaluation consultant who is available to the CBOs in service of the communities for training, for guidance, for even consolidation of data. But the main goal is not for Firelight to come in and monitor and judge or assess the worthiness of the CBO or of the program, but actually the intent is for the whole process to result in CBOs and communities having the knowledge and data that they need in order to assess whether their actions are making a difference and where they might need to course correct. I will hand it back to you, Laura, because I don't want to take up all the time.
Thanks, Sadaf. Thanks. And you've raised there a whole range of different implicit and explicit power dynamics. And with that, I want to turn to you, Raman, and ask about and thinking again about those implicit and explicit dynamics. Can you tell us about what your journey as a grant maker has been? What you've learned, what you aspire to, what does it look like?
Thank you, Laura. And I just feel, as Sadaf was saying, that I could just hear her, and this could be a masterclass on power dynamics, because we at Octava Foundation, in our time stamp of things, we are further behind on this curve. I feel we are a relatively young foundation, and we are learning at the speed of our failure. So what we have done over the last 5 years of our work has really evolved, right? So we started off as an organization wanting to just being a contributor to what was happening in a social sector in Singapore, and to say, do we have any usage to the folks around them? And we really just paid tuition fee as grantees to our grantees to learn alongside with them. And very quickly we realized that we were spreading ourselves too thin. So I wanted to also maybe unpack this piece around funders choose. And I think funders must choose where they can add most value. So I think there's nothing wrong with having a choice on what you fund in the context of the in the ecosystem that you operate in. But it's then the demonstration of what you fund and how transparent one can be in making sure that the ecosystem is aware of, and that you've taken into consideration the ecosystem as a whole and where the white spaces are. So that's what we are on that journey. We're doing simple things like we don't now use a grants proposal. We don't have a grants form. We got rid of that. Simply because we realized that it became a lot of admin for our own staff. And then we were forcing grantees to write into the boxes and the number of words and give us a log frame and the tools that they may not know, or and then they were imperfect. And we were very dependent on their articulation of their own case onto a grant form, which really didn't work. So we got rid of that. So now we just work with partners to say, just send us what you have. You don't have to produce anything. Whatever you have used in the most recent board meeting as your plan, we happily look at that. Because if it's good for your board, it should be good for us. So, so we kind of, but having said that, I must say, the ecosystem sometimes doesn't evolve with you. And then we have this burden as well. So I may say this to a grantee partner or a potential grantee partner, but they may still send me a proposal, and still one of their staff will, write to one of our directors or associates to say, do you have a grants form? Do you have an application form that I could fill? Because the sector as a whole is so based on send me a proposal, tell me what your logic framework is, tell me what your theory of change is. The burden of this service is needed is yours. So we've done those things. So one other thing that I just wanted to add before I pass back the time to you is taking away the burden of what need is and what exists. So the burden of justifying what provisions are needed and why those organizations are running those provisions, in our partnerships, we've taken that off them. So we've kind of worked with them over the last 2 years to identify what the gaps are in the primary education system and just listed them out to say, if you are working in this space, then we want to understand how you are solving for it rather than proving why the gap exists and why your service is needed. So as I said, we are learning at the speed of our failures, but I'll pass it back to you, Laura.
Thanks, Raman. And Ati's just rejoined us, but I'll keep the conversation going. And Ati then jump in. There's been a lot, I mean, what you've been saying over the course of the last couple of questions has prompted a lot of more practical questions in the chat. And I think what both of you have said so far really speaks a lot to listening, right? There's a lot to and that prompts questions. Well, how do you identify those to listen to? How do you, what are the processes you use for that? But Musa, I'm curious to hear what you think. And I want to hand over to you by asking, does this resonate? And maybe reflect a little bit on going back a step to think about what are the power dynamics that you think are problematic, and how easy is it to get to this point that Sadaf and Raman have talked about, that you're at the point of being able to then make some of those practical changes within your organization.
Thanks, Laura. And I think I'll refer back to some of the things that are already said in the chat and a point that Sadaf said, and that power is not just about financial resources. There's more to it when we think about shifting power. I think Sadaf talked about the internal work that organizations have to do in order to enable that sort of, one of the outputs being we can fund directly. And I'll be honest, when I came to the moral standpoint of shifting power, I did come with that very narrow view of what needs to happen is we need to directly fund organizations in the Global South. I will admit that I am a bit uncomfortable sometimes about the term shifting power, as it makes power seem like it's this, tangible transactional entity that you can just move from here to there. You know, over time, I've learned that shifting more money it's very naive because, you know, power is rooted in very complex systems. I think somebody talked about, you know, the colonial implications, the history, there's social, political, cultural, and economic contexts that are all wrapped up in power. And to paraphrase one of my colleagues who's really such a champion of this work at the foundation, you know, how we disrupt and dismantle and reimagine power is by examining self. So I think our institutions and the ecosystems that we talk about, they're made of individuals, they are made of people. And people are shaped by those colonial, historical, economic, social, and cultural contexts. And if I think about myself, my values, my beliefs, and I'm a product of many systems. So if I think about who I am, I'm female, I'm Malawian, I'm from an elite community, I went to really good schools, I work in philanthropy, and I live in Australia. You know, all those layers play out in the various relationships and connections that I have with our grantees who we refer to as partners, my colleagues and other funders. And so going back to that question or the idea of directly funding local organizations, we hold certain stereotypes. You know, there's always that stereotype, oh, we can't fund small organizations because, you know, potentially they won't be able to use money. We have certain particular views of like women-led organizations or indigenous organizations. So those are the things that we need to check. What are those assumptions that we have? What are the unconscious bias and the quick shortcuts that we make around decisions? And so I think really, and to go to Sadaf's point, the eternal work that we need to do needs to start with ourselves, because if we want to inculcate a culture of fairness, of justice, we need to have difficult conversations internally with ourselves, with our board, with our colleagues, and then that sort of radiates out into how we can think about who we fund, how we fund, what we fund.
Thank you so much, Musa, for that. That was really said so well. I was thinking of the internal work of fairness and justice before we do the external work. Thank you for bringing that thought here. I'm going to shift gears and thank you for all of your patience as I got knocked off the internet for reasons I can't really explain. I'm going to shift to Stefan. So Stefan, for you, the IDP Foundation has worked in Ghana supporting independent, low-fee private schools over a decade. What has been the most important lesson for you about how the funder power dynamic works?
Thank you, Ati. And I think we're having a very great conversation about power and probably sharing a little bit about IDP's journey and how this comes into play and how, you know, we responded to our situation in our own way, how we see power. So when I shared the story of the co-founders of the foundation first visiting Ghana within visiting schools within Ghana, within the affordable non-state schools, and interacting with independent sole proprietor education entrepreneurs, it was rather surprising for them to know that these entrepreneurs and the work that they were doing were largely not recognized and not supported. And for them, this was also an organic solution to solving a problem of access to education or contributing to access to education, especially in places where public education was not reaching. So it was quite evident that these schools, low-fee private schools, were not supported, no support from the government, banks were seeing them as risky, and nobody was really responding to or supporting the work that they were already doing. It was clear also that at that time they were complementing education provision, and today close to a third of all learners at the pre-tertiary level. It was quite evident, you know, as funders for them to really sit back and say that the best support they could give was to support these front runners, these local entrepreneurs, change makers who are already solving and contributing to the change. And for them, it was a realization that, hey, it is not a foreign aid fix to the problem that's going to work. It's not for them to be the ones telling these change makers what to do. And that was, for us, the moment and the realization that supporting local actors to extend and support the work and advance the causes that we're doing was the right way to go. For us, the lessons have been that we need to listen more. You need to observe what is happening and you need to listen to what is being requested. It also means for us that we needed to think about how we can elevate a catalytic process to support the organic solutions that were being led by these local change makers. So this led us to partnering with a microfinance partner that was able to de-risk these schools, so was able to extend school improvement loans to these schools, and also able to extend training in terms of financial management training for these schools. And today we are happy to say that we've been able to, through this partnership with local actors, reach about 1,000 schools that are serving about 200,000 learners. Again, for us, the learning from this is saying that if we especially can move the needle of improving education outcome in the lower and middle income countries, we need an all hands on deck approach. And then we would be able to then extend and really complement and advance education outcomes globally, especially in the global south. The other bit around this, and just to sum it a bit, is also to say that as it was in the past, it remains a lot to do with learning. We need to learn from what our local actors are doing. We need to remain agile. We need to be adaptable. And more importantly, be able to empower local actors who are advancing this change. Just to close off, I would like to just also share a few thoughts around the broad aspect of power. And I think that it is very important for us to all admit that power exists and expresses in different forms. Individual power, collective power, the power of the purse, and it expresses in different ways. And I think that for us to really deal with it and be able to get the best out of it, we need to be very clear and even have conversations about what power is between local actors and funders. It's very important to encourage conversations around it, to identify what power that each of us have, but how, more importantly, how to leverage that power. If, for example, in defining what success looks like for a donor and for a local actor, would be two different things. And it's very important for all of us to talk about it. What does power mean to you? What does power mean to me? And then I think that through all that, we were able to even define shared goals, shared successes, and be able to move the needle on a lot of the things that we have a shared interest in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefan. It makes me think of, we all have the power to do something as well. So it's kind of really looking at not kind of being scared of power and kind of, it feels like sometimes we're throwing it like a hot potato. No one really wants to own that they have power, but part of the work is really owning it. And as Musa was saying, the internal work then of fairness and justice can really begin when we actually acknowledge what power we have as an individual or collectively. Thank you so much for that. I'm gonna turn to Gail. We heard a lot about internal work, power, and local solutions, learning from local actors. Is all of this feasible? Can power truly shift when the money still comes from one direction, particularly as we would think of like the West or the global North? And what about this trend in giving in BRICS, the theory that the explosion of individual giving from money made by the growing rich in the middle income countries will see the end of this kind of aid as we know it? How will this shift power? I know these are kind of a ton of big questions, but really thinking of like maybe is where we start. Thank you, Gail.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, first to just say, I'm based in South Africa. Our funding has been locally generated, and as you were saying, Ati, this is a trend that's happening in some of the BRICS country where you have a lot of locally emerging foundations. And let me reflect on some of the power issues in a local context, okay, and ease into that some of the North-South debates. I think we've spoken a lot about the internal work that needs to be done, but I wanted to reflect on three other power dynamics that happen, and that is power dynamics between funders, okay, and the power that you draw from perhaps your experience. You know, you have a foundation that's been going for 30 years working in education, and newer foundations been established, and how do you distribute that power of and co-create a learning environment from that experience between funders? You also have the power of who has the most money. And that's where some of, I suppose, the global North-South issues come in, because obviously with currency debates, Northern donors coming into a country like South Africa, their currency creates much more availability of funding, and that needs to be recognized in engaging with local funders, so that the power of what they bring is trying to shift that power in working with local funders. I mean, there's also power in the nonprofit sector. I wouldn't want to romanticize the notion of nonprofits and communities as not having power issues as well. And in particularly in South Africa, that leads to an issue of our own transformation debates. And how are we actually dealing with power that shifts power from some of the nonprofit organizations that are led, and I'm using race in its broadest term here, by white leaders, and how do we shift that into growing leadership and NGOs led by Black individuals, and that's particularly important in South Africa, being a majority Black country. And then the last bit that, and I'm interested to hear from other foundations that are locally based, in a situation where we experience government power, okay? And in a country where government acts as a developmental state, they have the power to set the agenda of what gets funded in education. I mean, we have even regulation that allows for corporates to actually deliberately fund developmental initiatives in South Africa, and that's your license to do business in South Africa. And in that way, government has a lot of power. And how do we manage that power relationship that government can, as I say, determine the agenda in what gets funded and where it gets funded. So that's just broadly an introduction to some of the power issues that are being grappled with in a local context, as I say, from internal work between funders within the nonprofit sector, and now adding in a notion of government and bringing in those power dynamics as well. I'll touch on some of the tangible ways, you know, to deal with some of that later.
Thank you so much, Gail. You know, we talked a lot about the power dynamics with you, and I think to kind of wrap up this section of our conversation, it was really fascinating to hear about the power of government, and also the importance of, when we work in certain countries that have their own sovereignty and design their own plans, the importance of that power really comes into also then what is the role of philanthropy in terms of following the lead of government in terms of certain areas versus does it become where it's always in conflict with government and the policies of a specific government. So thank you for that. I think one thing that I was reflecting on as you were talking about the nonprofit dynamics between local actors is, this system of rewarding winners, which is kind of the system of philanthropy that we all work in, tends to also create that dynamic everywhere it goes, just because whoever is popular or has the most support or is known the most seemingly gets the most money and creates its own dynamics kind of like in other areas as well. So I'm hoping that maybe in the next left time, we will get to discuss some of these reflections. So as we kind of shift a little bit into practical solutions and some tangible ways that you think things can change, because we often hear about these topics which came up a lot today of localization, decolonization, changing systems, transformation, resilience. And the question always is kind of how can we make sure they become more than just buzzwords and are actually being implemented? So to start us off, Steph, I'm going to come to you first around the lessons from IDF on how to localize grant making and what you've done so far and kind of what practical thoughts you can give us. And then I'll come back to Gail to walk us through some of her work as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Arti. And it's just to help you here, IDP Foundation. So we have a recent experience, and this is from COVID. And I think that it really exemplifies what localizing grant making could look like. And for us, it was a whole learning journey. So for, low-fee private schools, in March 2020, faced 10 months of school closures in a very abrupt way. They were never prepared for it. A lot of the proprietors and school leaders were left in a place where they were really unsure about the futures of the schools. And as I underscored earlier, these schools are reaching close to a third of all learners at the pre-tertiary level. Most of them couldn't resort to, virtual learning systems because of obvious capacity and connectivity issues. Most of them had, about 95% of them had their operating capitals all depleted. Teachers were resigning, majority of them reported that, and the infrastructure and assets were also going bad. So it was obvious that IDP needed to respond. And so we launched a series of conversations with our local partners, and it was evident that we needed to provide some support to these schools. But how were we going to help these schools? What could the help look like? And how were we going to deploy it? And that was a bit difficult for us. And it for us initiated a need to learn and listen more to first the schools, as well as our local partners, and co-design what could possibly be a good response to the challenge that we faced. So of our learnings, it became obvious, from our local partner that we needed to prioritize the most vulnerable schools and those that were at risk of not reopening. It was also quite evident that understanding that a lot of these schools had taken loans and were not able to pay back the interest on the loans for a period of time, any response towards this should look at providing a forgiveness of these loans and also protecting the integrity of the portfolio within the microfinance partner. Obviously, schools also needed direct grants to be able to recover from the effects of COVID. But that was just, what we were facing. How were we going to approach this? And this is where, for me, for us as a funder, it was a great learning experience. And we also realized, the strength and the capacity of building local partnerships. So we had our local partner develop a ranking of schools based on their vulnerability. They went ahead to really validate these rankings that were done at the local level. They put together a very simple grant process where proprietors were helped to fail, basically asking them questions about what they needed, what were their most problems and issues they needed to solve, and then being able for the schools to express their needs, the local partners to really vet these needs, and also put together a solution that we could just approve and provide the funding to. In all this, the bottom-up approach for us was very successful. We could reach a good number of the schools. It was a very good expression. I mean, the response really went to meet the needs of the schools, because these schools were able to tell us what their needs were and what they needed to get their schools ready to receive learners. Our local partner his capacity of assessing vulnerability in developing a vulnerability assessment tool was quite helpful. Its support that it provided to the schools in applying for these grants, and being able to recommend to IDP of what a solution in terms of a grant to a school could look like for us to just approve was quite also revealing. And I would also say that the opportunity to have joint monitoring with our local partner to actually see what some of the grants that schools had received were used was also a great learning experience for us. Most of the schools use these grants to help bring back their teachers, because most of them were losing teachers. So they paid for the arrears of teacher salaries so that teachers could return and also put their schools in a good shape to receive learners.
Thank you, Stefan. In the interest of time, we have to get through a lot of other questions. If you don't mind, we move on.
Sure.
Thank you so much. Gail, I'm coming to you. I know we have about just a little under 10 minutes left for the entire discussion with the panel, so I'm trying to get through a few of the other ones. So talk us through what shifting the power would look like in practice. What does this mean for your day job, your identification of pipeline, and your approach allocating funding, and your engagement with those you fund? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'll respond at the level of shifting power with government, and then our actual work with local nonprofits, and then just a bit about the funding ecosystem. In terms of a context with government having so much power in terms of the agenda, we found it important that we work with government in terms of supporting education outcomes at school level, but also support organizations that can hold government accountable. Because even if you're in a development state and in a democracy, it's important to hold government to account for delivery of service, and just having that dual funding focus in some way helps us manage the power over government. In terms of the funding ecosystem, we felt it's very important that we fund bodies where we can have these debates like the local association of philanthropy organizations, like the local association of NGO education NGOs, because you're creating a platform for dialogue and discussion around these power issues and shifting power issues between the different stakeholders. In our own work, like Ramon is saying, we've decided not to go for unsolicited proposals. We think we can manage the power better if we have a strategy and we call for expressions of interest around a specific area of work that we want to do. Then we sit and co-create with the nonprofit partner before we go to the board. In looking at the budget, it's very holistic in terms of looking at the nonprofit's own organizational development, as well as the delivery of the education initiative. We have joint steering committees with governments, and we have joint reflection and problem-solving sessions. So in a way, I'm saying the way we fund and the way we work is a particular form of grant making where we work alongside, in partnership, jointly own the project in terms of dealing with problems and looking at the learnings and sharing those learnings broadly with the sector. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Gail. Definitely sharing our learning becomes one of the most important ways that we can continue to make improvement in this area. Musa, coming back to you, how as a sector do we hold ourselves accountable that we are shifting power, and how can we be held accountable by our partners and project participants? Is this something, do you as a group of funders track feedback, for example, from your partners on the ground? Thank you.
Thanks, Ati. And I think this is a question that I'd love to hear other perspectives, like what other foundations are doing, as well as if there are any implementing organizations or non-for-profits in the, what from your perspective has good accountability look like in this space. I mean, I certainly don't think I have the answers, but I think good accountability involves certain features, particularly if we think about shifting power. I think it's a combination of asking for, or even having even just an open door where your partners can speak up when they have issues. Having an open door is not an easy thing to have, but creating an environment where it is safe to speak up, particularly about issues that they have. I think it's also about having feedback loops. And so when you are listening and hearing from partners, making sure you feedback, we heard you, this is what we've done. Is it responding to your particular needs? What are the ways that we can improve? I think it involves a certain level of transparency and sharing. And then there's always this question around the metrics, like, is there a metric or is there a number that we can use to quantify what it means to shift power? And it's very uncomfortable to talk about metrics in this space because you can't take using metrics as a particular systems view of measuring success. And so imposing that systems view on a space that's very complex is very challenging. But, to, I think, Ramon's point, we live in a world of log frames and theories of change and having to report to our boards. So sometimes we need to do these things in numbers, and sometimes the numbers that we use is the percentage of funds that go directly to particular, for example, local organizations, or the percentage of funds that go to sort of BIPOC-led organizations. Is that a good metric? Is there a better metric? I think at least it does, even though it's not a metric that we might want to measure ourselves against, it allows us to at least interrogate the ways in which we're going about things. But I really do welcome, a conversation around what good accountability looks like. And I'd really love to hear from any non-for-profits that might be on the call.
Thank you so much, Musa, for that. Hoping if there's anyone with those thoughts to hold it for another maybe 5 minutes until we get our other panelists' notes in, but it is a a conversation we think about with our work at the African Visionary Fund as well, around how do we measure, but what measurement systems are we using, and are we just adopting maybe a measurement system that was not really designed for the kind of work we're trying to do. So thank you for that note. Sadaf, coming to you, some funders may say that these ideas and approaches can seem overwhelming or just too far removed from where they are operating today. So do you have any practical suggestions on how to start to start that shift? You know, I think Musa has brought it up, Gail has brought it up, Stefan, earlier, around the things we can do internally, but just kind of walk us through what you think could be a good way for some organizations, people who might be struggling on figuring out what is the first step.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a journey. And I think shift is exactly the right word for the things that we can do as a starting point. You know, because change takes time, and even small shifts over time do lead up to a pretty substantial transformation. So maybe I would suggest 3 major areas of shift, and they all build on what my colleagues have shared here. You know, the first is really to unpack what success means to us, what impact means, what sustainability means, what effectiveness means. If we really think about success as deep and lasting change in systems and in root causes, then we start seeing the value of community members, people affected by issues having power and ownership and agency over improving their lives and the lives in their community. When we're focused on that kind of impact, that kind of success, then we start valuing different things. We value community-driven action. We start valuing communities having decision-making power and tools and resources to take the action that they need. We start caring about what communities themselves view as success and impact. It reduces our emphasis on reach and scale, on replicability, on cost per beneficiary, cost effectiveness, or some predetermined indicators of quality from the global north. And I think that's where starting to think deeply about what does success really mean to us in the long term, not those symptomatic results, but the long-term success, what does that mean to us? If we follow that in that path of thinking, then we start seeing the value of grassroots civil society leaders, practitioners, organizations, activists. You know, if we're seeing success as deep and lasting systemic change, then we see that effectiveness is also about the capacity to create that change. And then the importance of local leaders and local practitioners is critical. And they're not just one possible actor among many others in the development system, but actually they're quite critical as change agents in the development space. They're not just critical in their own local community development, but they're actually important, critical for them to be present in global discussions and decisions, both in our internal organization processes, as well as these kinds of broader sectoral discussions. So we shouldn't be having conversations with only funders and INGOs, but grassroots civil society should be present and active and respected as trusted leaders, trusted partners, holders of knowledge and expertise and insight, and quite strategic in their activism and practice. And then third, for me, relevant to our conversation here today, is that it means we have to deconstruct and reconstruct the funder-grantee relationship. One of the things Firelight has been advocating for some time, along with many other organizations, is the need to shift from a more charity-based top-down approach to solidarity and justice-focused approaches. And these approaches have embedded with them respect, trust, long-term and relational mutual accountability, less restrictions, more enabling, and really the space, the time, and the resources for local civil society to work with their community hand in hand to identify and work on the issues that are affecting them. And not to put in a plug or anything, but if in case anyone is interested, Firelight does have a resource kit, a toolkit, addressing some of these very questions, and, documenting some of our own learnings and offering tools to others. But I think the takeaway is that it's a journey. And if we start by making these small shifts in how we understand the issues and how we, how our understanding of the issues influences how we interact with one another and work with one another, and even talk about these issues, we start actually heading down that journey.
Thank you so much, Sadaf. If deep change is the goal, then working with local actors is critical, and I appreciate you for bringing that to the table. Last but not least, Raman, we're going to, before we move to the Q&A with our audience, do you think these practical changes could lead to a tipping point in the funder-partner or funder-fundee relationship, and a real shift in power could happen? Can you think of a real life example to give us here?
Thank you. And yes, I think the answer to how is yes. So I resonate with Sadaf's point on it's a journey. Each one of us as part of the value chain of creating outcomes for learners, we are part of that value chain, and we are somewhere, and that value chain may not be linear. So it's kind of recognizing that we are a value chain of sorts, along with the government, the other partners, the ecosystem players, and what does that value chain look like in the location and the geographies that you operate in. I think reframing the ecosystem in a value chain get rid of that power framing. When you look at it as we need each other to create that end goal for learners to thrive in our systems. I think that, and how do I wanted to maybe bring the conversation to some practical examples of how we are doing it, whether we are doing it successfully, the jury is out there, but what we are attempting to do with the grantee organizations or our partnership organizations. We've had a think about what is it that we bring to the table. And a traditional way was, we bring a stash of cash and a partner brings a program. And there you go, right? That's your grantee-grantor relationship. So we've kind of overcome that in our own minds and with our own board, and where we've started to recognize all of us are bringing in this partnership a set of resources, program being a resource, an intervention being a resource. We bring time, we bring talent, we bring treasures, and we bring networks. And how do we work with partners, and how do partners work with us to unlock all of these resources to create a larger, bigger, scalable program, or better infused outcomes, or a system advocacy policy. So in the context of anything that we do, we're starting to reframe what we bring to the table and what partners bring to the table in terms of what is the diverse resources that are on the table. The other change we've done is we have stopped asking for, or actually that I reframe it, we haven't stopped asking for better monitoring or robust monitoring frameworks, and really getting to the outcome versus the output conversation with our partners. But while we ask for it, we have started to take that journey of how can we build a monitoring learning framework for ourselves and with our partners for the programs that we go in. So we fairly squarely pay for what it takes to help organizations build monitoring and evaluation frameworks for themselves that are going to last them beyond our partnership and beyond that grantee-grantor relationship that we might be inducting in. So going back to that practical capacity building that some of you have raised. And the third thing we have actively started doing, again, the jury is out there if that's of any use to anybody else, but we found it with our partners, is every time we've created a piece of knowledge that was internal facing to support our own strategic decision making on what we fund and how we fund it and why we should fund this and not that, we have put that knowledge piece out for the community. So in forms of white papers or what have you, and have brought in then platforms to deliberate on those insights. So it doesn't become oh, Octava Foundation has this white paper and that becomes the gospel truth, but actually to say, this is what we think we found. We'd love to know what else have we missed, or what else do you think you belong? So just some practical things that we are doing on our everyday grant making, if you like, just to kind of shift that. I'm not sure we are doing this in the context of shifting power. I think we're doing this so that we can get to capacity building organization, effective organizations creating efficacious programs and having better learner outcomes. And in that spirit, you just doing what it takes to build those partnerships.
Thank you, Raman, for that. As you know, we've heard so many really fascinating ways this could be done, so many thoughts from the ground, ideas on how you've all been doing it. So I want to now open up, and before I do, I just want to thank you all our distinguished panelists. Before I open up this conversation to the audience, I think Musa has something that she wants to add. So as we get on with some of Musa's thoughts, I encourage the rest of the audience to think about what conversation would you like to have in the next about 15 minutes. If you want to type some thoughts in the chat, or if you want to raise your hands, and then we can have you chime in on this live as well. Thank you so much. Off to you, Musa.
Yeah, I liked Mayur's question in the chat. So his question was, is there a danger that supporting certain solutions funders create an echo chamber of what works and what can't, thereby making it difficult for diversity of solutions to come up? And I think Raman's point that she ended with sort of kind of answers his question around, like, you know, this is how, sorry, Raman, I feel like I'm speaking for you, but that was one of the ways I was going to suggest to Mayur, because yes, there is a danger. And I will say that, and, you know, one of the things that I know, I'm living and working in Australia and trying to support an education program, you know, I'm very far removed from where the proximate work actually happens. So there is a danger of, you know, living in echo chambers and coming up with ideas and solutions that are not actually relevant or useful on the ground. Also, we come to this work with certain networks and certain people that we know that might be similar to the ways that we think, right? We tend to connect with people that are very similar to us. And so we need to think about how we break those, you know, those mental models of always finding people who are similar to us, but challenging ourselves to look out of the box and engage with others and trying to be much closer to the work. So for example, my colleague Faith, I think she's on the call, she's kind of given me that, you know, Musa, you need to challenge me, you know, when I'm thinking about something in a particular way. So, you know, that's like one particular example. And the second one is thinking about, as we're developing our strategies, you know, I think a lot of organizations review the strategies, really thinking about how wide are you casting the net in terms of engaging and working with others to understand like what is out there and what we can be supporting. Sorry, I just wanted to make that comment.
Thank you so much. That was really a really good way of connecting those dots. I appreciate it. There's a question that came up earlier in the chat that I wanted to bring up to anyone who's interested in answering this, which is the question is from Peter Colenso on whether funding the World Bank to try to get most impact is embedding existing power dynamics. So I'm not sure who is interested in kind of engaging in this conversation.
Sorry, I was going to jump in. You know, I'm coming from a very specific standpoint here, and the World Bank is probably a little bit more invested in maintaining the status quo of systemic injustice in the world. And if we really want to dismantle systemic injustice, we probably have to, I don't know if supporting big organizations like the World Bank is going to help us move in that direction. And I know that's not a very helpful answer, but it just that question raises a whole bunch of red flags for me. Yeah, I'd love my colleagues to jump in.
Yeah, I think if I may chime in here until someone else wants to maybe be involved as well. You know, it does have, the World Bank does work to answer to specific bodies, and that's the interest of the World Bank, and they are very open about that. So I think supporting that really is saying that's the interest we support. And yeah, it is it definitely has those power dynamics that we are talking about.
If I can jump in, there is a new head which is going to come to World Bank, hopefully, who with MasterCard did try to shift a lot of the power dynamics. So maybe when Ajay comes in, fingers and toes crossed, we don't know, but maybe we should look at it as an opportunity to bring about change. I think that would be something which would be very good. I know that at Catalyst, all those who are working in the education working group are trying to see how we can liaise with World Bank to try to make that happen. And also USAID, because that's the shift which has to come. And yeah, so I think that is possible. At least I'm optimist. Maybe I'm just being very optimistic and will fail and feel miserable, but you know.
Well, we need optimists in this world, don't we? Thank you. There was another question that came up from Claire. How do the panel manage exit strategies, which is always an important topic in funding within the funder grantee power dynamic, and keeping sustainability as a key driver? This also even brings the question of what does sustainability mean to a funder, or to some funders. So anyone who's interested in taking on this.
Yeah. As part of our, shifted approach of working with our community grantee partners, one of the big things we've done is started a conversation around beginning with the end goal in mind right at the beginning of any funding partnership. So we are very transparent about the amount of funding available and the years of funding available for a particular initiative or a particular grant partnership, and support the grantees to unpack with their communities. What do they want to achieve during that period of time? What does it mean for them to have had a successful grant partnership, not in terms of a particular program objective, but in terms of their long-term vision for what their community looks like? So for some organizations, that does mean establishing some sort of a longer-term structure or a form of organizational resilience. For some, it's more about building up community structures that can sustain any activities that are initiated during the grant timeline, etc. But I think for us, the main thing is to start the conversation right at the very beginning and to embed it within this larger piece around what is our ultimate vision and end goal, and how can we as a Firelight, a tiny and a short-term partner in your journey, how can we support you towards your end goal? So it's not about Firelight wants to do this and how are you going to sustain this project after we're gone, but actually your community, what do you want to achieve and how can we walk with you for this short period of time?
Thank you, Sadaf. Stefan, if you don't mind, I bring this question to you, given that your work has some kind of financial sustainability built in it. What does keeping sustainability as a key driver mean to you? Is that something you think about?
Yeah, I think that for us, specifically working with our partners, and sustainability has to be defined as a shared journey for both of us as a funder, but as well as for the local actor itself. And I think that a lot of the time when we look at how the definitions plays out, they are quite different, but are also shared. For the local partner, we want to see that the program exists beyond our funding or is able to be that attractive to attract other funders to keep it going on. We also want to see, for example, that local actors are empowered through the process of funding to even take, the action forward as a strategic, output for them as an organization. So we look at it in two main ways, and we try as much as possible to marry the two, and so that when there's a time to assess the different pathways, we both are in a safe space, make that decision. And we are both clear in our minds about what the next, the journey on both sides could look like. And I think that these two parameters are quite helpful in trying to set, what parameters of sustainability could look like.
Thank you so much, Stefan. We have a few more minutes. If there's anyone else who has questions or wants to add to any of these thoughts, whether it is around how to exit responsibly or power dynamics and how that's working. Gail, I think I see your hands raised. If you want to add a point.
Thanks. I mean, just to think about sustainability, I think a lot of us have spoken about sustainability in relation to the nonprofit, and that's looking beyond the program. It's around good organizational practices that you can contribute to, good governance, M&E systems, and that's about sustainability of that organization in terms of it going forward. Getting involved in other programs with other donors. But sustainability of the outcomes is something different. And I think that needs to be discussed upfront, because it can take very different forms. If you're thinking that this is a pilot, and what are you going to do at the end of the pilot? Is it something that you want to embed within government systems? And what does that look like beyond the program? So sustainability can be looked at with a variety of lenses, and important to look at that right at the beginning, because then you plan for that and involve all the different stakeholders in looking at what does sustainability look like at the end of the program.
Thank you so much, Gail. I think we have one or two questions. 1 second. There's one question around, which might be the last question we can answer. Is there any work or examples of shifting power from CSO to people? So this is more around kind of the next level of shifting power that comes from how do we make the people on the ground who are recipients or participants of the services that are provided by CSOs, the ones with the power. If there's anyone who's doing work on that, would love to hear their thoughts. Or anyone who's funding people who are doing work on that.
Not specifically in the education space, but maybe let me give a plug for another Catalyzing Change Week event that one of my colleagues is running, and that their work is really on Indigenous-led conservation, and that they're really working with supporting Indigenous communities be stewards of their land, and they have a session. I'll drop it in the chat later on. And I think there's some real good examples there of supporting sort of the governance structures that align with the values, the belief system of local people. And they work in places like Australia, Alto Mayo in Peru, boreal forests in Canada, and so they're having a session, I think, later today, and I'll put that in the chat. And I think that's a good example of shifting from an NGO to the actual people.
There are, if I can jump in, there are around 9 sessions in CCW on that across the board, because ultimately that's what we really want, and that's where we are shifting the needle. And we also launched Turning Wheels, which actually lays the foundation for that. So if anyone has examples, you can also share them with us so we can add them in Turning Wheels. So I think that is something which is there. And Ati, if I can also say in terms of the sustainability one, and now I'm not speaking with a Catalyst hat, but with the Aflatun hat, what we have done is actually transition to the government and have sustainability that way by including it in the curriculum and by then training the government training colleges to be able to take on the program. So by doing that, the outreach in the 40 countries where we've done it, we are reaching 33 million children. The problem is donors don't see that as success because there's not a project. But when you look at how we are doing it, so we have transitioned from Aflatun projects, included it in the curriculum, trained all the government, have the government monitor, no brand name for Aflatun at all. But the transition has been extremely smooth and effective, and outreach has been very, very high and very low cost. Our current outreach calculation is 33 cents per child. And that's really, really low. That's because that's how the partnership works. So I think if we have to look at sustainability, I always tell the Aflatun team, and I tell it to everyone, we should look at Aflatun having to shut down, because ultimately governments should be making the education system of such high quality that we don't need to, because it is the responsibility of the government and the state. So I think that's something I would say from sustainability. And building on that also, shifting the power. If you look at the overall, I've put it in the chat. We have a session tomorrow with 3 ministers of education on how social innovators can work with ministers of education and governments to be able to make sure we include some of the principles in the 21st century that we want in the curriculum and not just STEM. And if we can all, instead of donors doing it, if we can all just collaborate to make that happen, we can actually reach 100 countries by 2025. So I'm also asking you all to attend that and to help co-create it at every different country level. And there is no brand which will be attached. There'll be nothing, but then it's included in the governments and their curriculum. And I think that's what's very important. So I would,
so much.
Begging for a session and that. Thank you.
Thank you. There are a lot of sessions that have been shared in the chat, so please feel free to navigate for the rest of the week. As we're wrapping up, first and foremost, I want to thank our panelists for this insightful dialogue and for our audience for bringing in such insightful questions and conversations. To tie this up, I want to add that often we talk about shifting power. Those with power say that oftentimes we don't have the power to shift it, or to in the funding process, we often might think that we don't have the power to change things or to change the status quo. But these processes were designed by people, so we can all redesign if we all think that there's a small sliver that we can change. So I really believe that, you know, we as a team of people who work in this space we all have a specific kind of power, like it was brought up earlier. So if we think of how we can use that power to change things, that is possible. And we all have the agency to make a decision, however small or large, that will eliminate unnecessary obstacles and better relationships with education change makers on the ground. As it was brought up many times, acknowledging our power to make change is key to dismantling the power imbalance in philanthropy. So let's do this together and continue to learn from each other. Thank you all again, and enjoy the rest of the Catalyzing Change Week and some of the events that are also listed here in the chat. And I look forward to seeing you all at someplace soon. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks.